Intergenerationally, founder of the Deep and Meaningful Consultancy. Welcome to the Adda, a space for better conversations. This is a snapshot of one of our group conversations with Joshua Isaac Smith, who is a Leadership Fellow and Co-Facilitator of the Society of Leadership Fellows. In this conversation, we explore what racial trauma is and how this permeates intergenerationally and influences the very DNA of those that experience and live with it. We explored everything from the impact of microaggressions to systemic institutional racism and how these affect the body as well as the mind. The rest of the conversation was held in confidence for participants to be able to share and learn together freely. Hope you enjoy it. For more information, check out www.deepandmeaningful.co/the Adda.
Racial trauma is racial stress, that a race-based stress that is seeking an experience of recognition. And I'll talk about that again. So it's a race-based stress that is seeking a missing experience of recognition. The sort of dictionary definition is ongoing individual collective injuries that are suffered at the hands of basically white privilege and white dominance of racial minorities, people of color, and this can happen through disrespect, humiliation, discrimination, but it's ongoing, and that's the part that separates racial trauma from what we would think about as the textbook definition of trauma, which usually links to PTSD. And PTSD is acute trauma. It's from usually a single incident. And that trauma you treat very differently than you would race-based trauma. So the complication with race-based trauma, and why I define race-based trauma as racial trauma as race-based stress, is because to heal trauma, and this is all trauma, and this comes from a very famous psychotherapist who, in the 70s, very body-based psychotherapist, who basically talked about the missing experience. Ron Kurtz was his name. And Ron Kurtz helped to really spawn a whole generation of body-based psychotherapy. But he talks about the missing experience in healing trauma. And that's why I added on that part, race-based stress, seeking a missing experience of recognition, right? Because let's say when I work with a PTSD, for example, let's say somebody had a car accident, or let's say somebody had a cycling accident, which is very common here in London. And if any of you have had that, then this might resonate with you. In looking at that and treating that, essentially the focus is on treating the memory of it, because the trauma itself lives in the body. And this is a la Bessel van der Kolk, for those of you who are interested. The body keeps score. I did a lot of training with Bessel van der Kolk. And the idea is that trauma just isn't in the head. In fact, you can't, as a clinician, you can't really treat trauma from a cognitive perspective, right? Why? Because when we're in that traumatic reaction, the part of the brain that is able to generate language actually goes offline, right? So when we're in a fight or flight reaction, the blood flow goes away from the left prefrontal cortex to the visual centers and to the right emotional centers. So that's why if you've ever been in a traumatic reaction, like a shocking news or something like that, afterwards you can't really put together what happened. Maybe you can't even find words, right? So cognitive treatments out of the question. So you have to use more body-based experiences. And in that experience of, say, a car accident or a cycling accident, the missing experience for that particular client or that victim, the sufferer, is being normal, being safe, being able to get back in the car and drive and feel safe, not have the activation, not have the adrenaline triggering, not being able to hold the hands on the steering wheel without shaking. Or for the cyclist, it's being able to get back on their bike. Racial trauma involves ongoing exposure to to injuries, to microaggressions. And this means that we don't know if you're, so I'll speak for me and the clients I work with, is that people of color don't know when there's going to be racism again, when there's going to be discrimination again. There's no, what's the missing experience? How does a discriminated against person feel normal, right? In terms of looking at that definition of returning to normal or being able to feel safe. I'll give you a great example. So I had a meeting at Canary Wharf at Thomson Reuters. Thomson Reuters is one of the most secure buildings in London. I mean, beforehand, you had to give all this information. I had to show up with my passport, right? I mean, it's like you get vetted, essentially, right? So I'm going to my meeting after being let through the gates. I get into the lift, and a white woman in the lift clutches her bag, right? Now, I've shared this experience with other Black men, and they've going, yep, yep. Now, the thing about that is, in that moment, it's so shocking for me. I'm like, I wasn't expecting that. So I'm like, well, what do I do here? Do I get an attitude, right, and read her a bit? Do I just ignore it as if it didn't happen? Or do I just sit with it? Well, you know, in that process, though, I decided obviously to let it go because I'm focused on my meeting. But I still remember the color of her purse, which was white. I still remember the color. I remember the lift. I remember this as this environment. And that's how the body records trauma, right? It records it in my body. So I've had this happen several times in London, and it begins to add up. And that's sort of how microaggressions, which put me as the victim on a sort of microvigilance, meaning that I'm sort of not really relaxed ever. Even I might be relaxed mentally, like I'm not thinking it's going to happen, but my body stays in this sort of like a micro alertness. And this is the essence of what microaggressions, racial-based microaggressions, actually, the impact of it on people of color. It's not possible to really rest if you know that you've experienced these kinds of this disrespect, humiliation, being talked about behind your back because you're a person of color. These are things that begin to add up. Again, going back to this concept of recognition. Recognition is what helps our nervous system to actually calm down. Right? There's something called the social baseline theory. When we're basically around trusted others, our nervous system naturally relaxes because we realize there's not a threat out there, right? Or even if there is, when we're sort of around people, safe others, we can feel protected. So we don't have to, the brain doesn't have to go into overdrive looking out for danger. Chronic trauma, which is a form of trauma, it's a type 2 trauma, it becomes difficult to heal chronic trauma because there's always that threat. There's always the possibility that something can happen again. And I'm not in control of when it's going to happen, right? Very different than a single incident trauma like PTSD.
So I'm going to ask a big question as a final question, because from what you're saying, right, you're talking about this racial discrepancies that are so embedded, right, that they're seen, they're not seen. Because everything you talked about, like the depression, the obesity, the physical manifestations, chances are you see a doctor and they're not going to say to you, you're dealing with a legacy of 100 years of racial oppression.
400.
400. Well, hundreds of years of
that's better.
Of racial oppression. So let's get down and dirty with talking about that. You know, they treat the symptoms. They're not going to necessarily look at that. But then they've also got the systemic that you're talking about, right? And the organizations, the institutions. How do we heal when so much is so frigging broken?
What I'm focused on, which is really what I noticed that has really brought me into this conversation, which is racial compassion. And for me, we can begin to heal the white privilege and oppression dynamics. Because the problem is, you're almost asking, how do you get white people who are dominant, right? Who are pull the levers of power? How do you get them to suddenly begin to relax that sense of privilege? And by privilege, what I mean by that is the systems that make particularly white men dominant in our society. That's something psychologically that has been looked at. It's called social dominance orientation. That's something that is not easy, right? Because it's not easy for people in power to suddenly want to go into and invite equality, right? So you're dealing with a psychological block there. But it's something we can do if we understand that the sort of cost of imperialism, the cost of colonialism, means that there are people in the world, racial minorities in particular, right, people of color, who are still carrying that injury 400 years later, 200 years later, whatever it is. There is that opportunity in racial compassion to help create an environment of psychological safety, meaning that it's okay to speak about things. It's a safe environment, that there's empathy, that things can be actually looked at through a racial lens. And I think now we're more advantaged because of what's happened, the atrocities that have happened over the last, at least 5 years. It's all coming up, but it goes back many other years, obviously. But now there's a conversation about it. Now there's this, we're talking about racial trauma. That would not have happened 5 years ago if it weren't for the atrocities. More white people are buying books about Black people and Black history than ever before, right? Books have been out there for decades, but suddenly there's this rush to understand. So that's the other part of racial compassion, is be curious and learn, study people, right? And then the last aspect is being able to actually listen and communicate from the heart. And that's a very difficult thing for anyone to do, right? Because that makes us vulnerable and all those other things. But in practicing these, what happens deeper is we begin to, even if you're white, you begin to heal aspects of yourself. Because notice, the systemic aspect looks at the extrinsic measures and the extrinsic influences. So that's collective, but but each of us is responsible for our own experience, more the intrinsic experience. And that's what I'm really focused on, is helping people heal that intrinsic sense of misrecognition, not being acknowledged for who I really am because of the color of my skin or because of the gender, my gender, right? I'm focused on helping people develop the skills and the belief systems that it doesn't really matter. That's going to exist out there. You can't control that. But what you can do is build up your resilience and be able to face women clutching their bag if you're a Black man, or people suddenly locking their cars because they suddenly clock that you're walking towards them, right? Even though you're in a suit, which is my experience. But there is this sort of sensitivity to the unconscious bias that just exists with that. And by the way, unconscious bias is almost impossible to heal. It's awareness that helps us change our behavior. And this is where I think my anger comes up as a therapist, clinician, is that social dominance orientation, the research on that is that essentially people in positions of power don't really want things to change because they're benefiting from it. So you have a psychological bias towards keeping things the same. And that really frustrates me because you're spot on. I mean, where's the harm in inviting diversity to the table in all discussions? But it's not something that is done. I mean, board level position, there are very few people of color proportionately on boards of major organizations. There are some. There are very few people of color in the C-suite of the world's major corporations. So does that become something that becomes a priority, right? The reason why, to create systemic change, we actually need more inclusion. We need more diversity. That needs to be part of what what we're about as an organization, or do we stick to keeping the system based on profitability, based on other things? And who's to say that having someone diverse in leadership roles will lead to a lack of profitability? You see, so there are all these biases built in.